A hidden cedar chest carried Nora Whitaker's name, but she had never set foot inside the Cowboy's barn before that winter. Nora's fingers froze on the brass latch. Wind slammed against the barn walls, and snow hissed through the cracks in the wood. The lantern shook in her hand as she stared at her own name carved into the cedar chest. Outside, a horse stamped nervously in the storm. Inside, something waited beneath that lid. And suddenly, the quiet cowboy she had married to survive no longer seemed like a stranger at all. Before we open that chest, tell me where you're watching from today. The wind came down from the Bitterroot Mountains hard enough to rattle loose fence boards and send dust skittering across the frozen road. Nora Whitaker pulled her coat tighter and kept walking. Timber Creek sat behind her now. The bakery, the feed store, the boarding house where she had rented the same narrow room for nearly 3 years. By next week, it would belong to someone else. Mr. Garrison, the owner, had not been cruel about it. "My brother's family is coming in before Christmas," he had said, standing behind the desk with his ledger open. "I can't turn them away." He had even given her extra time. It changed nothing. Nora had counted her money 3 times the night before, then a 4th. The result never changed. Not enough for another room. Not enough for a wagon west. Not enough for winter. The road curved along a creek half covered with ice. Beyond it stood Cedar Run Ranch, tucked against the foothills beneath a gray Montana sky. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney. Wyatt Cole lived there, 38 years old, a cattleman, a man who rarely came into town unless he needed supplies, horseshoes, or mail. People respected him. Most people left him alone. Nora stopped at the gate. For a moment she almost turned around. The iron latch felt cold beneath her glove. Then she opened it. The walk to the house seemed longer than it should have. Snow clouds were gathering over the mountains. A horse lifted its head from the corral and watched her pass. The porch boards creaked beneath her boots. She knocked once. Nothing. Twice. Footsteps crossed the floor inside. The door opened. Wyatt Cole filled the doorway. Broad shoulders, dark coat, calm eyes. He looked surprised to see her, but only slightly. "Nora." It was the first thing he said. Not Miss Whitaker, not ma'am, just Nora, as if he had already spoken her name 100 times. She swallowed. "I need to ask you something." He waited. The wind pushed against her back. She could feel the cold working its way through her sleeves. "I need a practical arrangement," she said. "A marriage, in name only. I can cook. I can mend clothes. I can keep a house running. I won't ask for anything beyond a roof and a chance to get through winter." Silence settled between them. Far off, a raven called from a cottonwood tree. Wyatt looked at her for so long that she began to regret every step that had brought her there. Then he stepped aside. "Come inside." The warmth hit her first, then the smell of coffee. The house wasn't what she expected. Everything was clean, not fancy, just cared for. A lamp sat polished on a side table. Firewood was stacked neatly beside the hearth. A wool blanket hung folded over the back of a chair. Nothing felt temporary. Nothing felt lonely. Wyatt showed her through the house without many words. The kitchen, the pantry, then a small room near the back. "Yours," he said. Nora stopped in the doorway. The bed was made. A quilt lay folded across the footboard. The window had fresh curtains. The room did not look newly prepared. It looked ready, as if someone had been expecting it to be occupied. She ran her fingers across the dresser. No dust, not even a little. Something stirred in the back of her mind. A question she couldn't quite form. Wyatt left her there to look around. When she turned toward the window, Her eyes landed on a small work table sitting beneath the afternoon light. A sewing frame rested beside it. Next to the frame sat a wooden box. Nora crossed the room slowly. She opened it. Spools of thread, needles, a silver thimble. The exact kind she preferred. The same brand sold only by the general store in Timber Creek. Her breath caught. For a long moment she simply stared. Then she looked toward the doorway where Wyatt had disappeared. Because Wyatt Cole had never once stepped inside her sewing shop. At least, not that she knew of. And yet somehow, everything on that table looked as though it had been waiting for her. Nora closed the wooden sewing box and stood very still. Outside the window, snowflakes drifted across the yard. A gelding shifted near the fence line. Somewhere in the distance, a gate creaked in the wind. Nothing about Cedar Run Ranch made sense. She spent her first week learning the rhythms of the place. Wyatt left before sunrise most mornings. By the time the eastern sky turned pale silver above the mountains, he was already out checking fences or feeding stock. He never demanded conversation, never hovered, never acted as though she owed him anything. That alone made it easier to breathe. The marriage papers were signed quietly at the county office 3 days after her arrival. A clerk stamped them with a dull iron seal and slid them across the counter. No celebration, no wedding supper, just paperwork and winter necessity. When they returned to the ranch, Wyatt carried a sack of flour into the pantry while Nora hung her coat by the door. Life settled into an unexpected calm. She cooked. She mended shirts. She repaired torn saddle blankets for neighboring ranch hands. And little by little, she began noticing things. One morning, she carried her coffee into the front room and froze. The reading chair beside the east window had been moved. Not much. Only a few feet. But now the morning sunlight fell perfectly across the seat. Exactly where she liked to sit while sewing. She glanced toward Wyatt. He was eating oatmeal at the table. He never mentioned the chair. A few days later, she walked into the barn and found a chestnut mare waiting in the aisle. The horse stood patiently while she approached. No nervous shifting, no pinned ears, just quiet attention. "She's gentle," Wyatt said while checking a bridle strap. Nora rested a hand on the mare's neck. "What's her name?" "Daisy." The horse nudged her shoulder softly. Nora smiled before she could stop herself. "I haven't ridden much." "I know." The words came naturally. Too naturally. Wyatt seemed to realize it at the same moment she did. A strange silence followed. Then he returned to his work. Nora said nothing, but the question stayed with her all afternoon. How did he know? The next surprise came in the kitchen. She opened a cupboard looking for tea and found 3 tins of dried peppermint leaves. Not common black tea, not coffee. Peppermint, her favorite. The exact kind Martha Bell sold at the bakery every autumn. That evening, she carried 1 tin to the supper table. "Did you buy this recently?" Wyatt glanced at it. "Maybe a month ago. A month? Something like that." Nora stared. She hadn't even spoken to him a month ago. He looked down at his plate and cut another piece of beef. Conversation ended there. The questions didn't. By early December, people in Timber Creek had started talking. Nora heard it first at Martha Bell's bakery. The smell of fresh bread filled the warm room, while snow gathered along the windows. Martha handed her a paper sack of rolls. "Ignore them." "Ignore who?" Martha sighed. "The people who think they know everything." That answer told Nora enough. Across the room, Clara Pike sat with 2 friends. Their voices dropped when Nora looked over, then rose again after she turned away. The message was clear. People had opinions, most of them wrong. Nora left with her bread and her dignity intact. But the ride home felt longer than usual. That afternoon, she found Wyatt repairing a gate hinge near the north pasture. He noticed her expression immediately. "Something happen in town?" She hesitated. "No." He studied her for a moment, then nodded once. He didn't push. That somehow made it worse, because part of her wanted him to. A week later, Martha Bell visited the ranch carrying a basket of cinnamon bread. She and Nora stood in the kitchen while snow drifted outside. The conversation wandered from weather to livestock to winter supplies. Then Martha casually said something that stopped Nora cold. Wyatt worked himself half to death fixing this place up last summer. Nora looked up. "What?" Martha smiled. "The painting, the repairs, new curtains, new flooring in the guest room. He started back in August." August. Nora felt the room tilt slightly. She hadn't come to Cedar Run Ranch until late November, 3 months later. Martha kept talking, but Nora barely heard the rest. That night she walked slowly through the house, past the fireplace, past the freshly painted walls, past the guest room. August. The word stayed with her. She carried a lantern out to the storage barn before bed. Snow dusted the roof. The air smelled of leather and hay. She moved between stacks of saddle blankets and old tack. Then she noticed something odd. Near the back wall, beneath a layer of dust, sat a clean rectangular outline on the floorboards. Something heavy had rested there, for years, judging by the marks, and it had been moved often, more often than anything else in the barn. Nora knelt beside it. Her lantern light flickered across the wood. The shape was unmistakable. A chest, a large one. She reached out and touched the worn floorboards, then slowly lifted her head, because for the first time since arriving at Cedar Run Ranch, she felt certain of one thing. Wyatt Cole was keeping a secret, and whatever it was, somehow, it had something to do with her. The thought stayed with Nora through the rest of December. It followed her into the kitchen each morning while she kneaded biscuit dough. It sat beside her while she stitched torn coat sleeves beneath the east window. It rode with her into Timber Creek whenever she needed thread, lamp oil, or supplies. The ranch had become familiar. The mystery had not. Christmas came and went quietly. Snow covered the valley in long white sheets. The mountains disappeared behind clouds for days at a time. Smoke rose from chimneys across Timber Creek and drifted low beneath the winter sky. Nora and Wyatt settled into routines that felt almost natural. Almost. One evening she found herself laughing at something Martha Bell had said over supper. The sound surprised her. It surprised Wyatt, too. He looked up from his coffee cup. Just for a second. Something softened in his face. Then it disappeared again. That brief look stayed with her longer than it should have. January arrived with harder weather and harder gossip. People had stopped whispering. Now they talked openly. Nora heard it outside the mercantile, inside the bakery, near the church steps. Some said she had married Wyatt for security. Others said Wyatt had lost his senses. Clara Pike seemed determined to keep every rumor alive. Whenever Nora entered a room, conversations shifted. Voices lowered. Eyes followed. Nora carried herself with dignity and kept walking, but the weight of it wore on her. One Sunday afternoon, the entire town gathered inside the church hall after service. The pastor wanted volunteers to help families whose livestock had suffered during the storms. What should have been a simple meeting turned into something else. Ezekiel Pike stood near the front of the room. Tall, well-dressed, confident in the way wealthy men often are. He spoke about community responsibility. Then somehow the conversation turned toward Cedar Run Ranch, toward Wyatt, toward Nora. "No offense intended," Ezekiel said smoothly. "But some arrangements are easier to make when a man is lonely." The room went quiet. Nobody looked directly at Nora, which somehow felt worse. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at the floor. Nora felt heat rise into her face. She kept her chin level. She refused to look away. Then a chair scraped across the floor. Wyatt stood. The sound alone silenced the room. He wasn't angry in the way some men became angry. His voice never rose. His hands stayed at his sides. But something about him changed. The stillness became heavier, more deliberate. He looked directly at Ezekiel Pike. "She stays." Silence. "If anyone has a problem with that," Wyatt continued, "they can bring it to me. Nothing more. No speech. No threat. Just certainty. The kind that leaves no room for argument." Even Ezekiel seemed unsure how to respond. The meeting moved on. People found other things to discuss, but Nora barely heard any of it. The words echoed inside her long after they left the church. "She stays. Not my responsibility. Not my arrangement. Not my obligation. She stays." The ride home happened beneath a pale winter sunset. Snow sparkled across the valley. Neither of them spoke much. At one point, Wyatt adjusted his horse alongside hers. "You all right?" Nora nodded. "Yes." He seemed unconvinced, but he let the answer stand. That night, she watched him from across the supper table. The same quiet man, the same careful habits, the same mystery. Yet somehow he looked different now, less distant, more real. A week later, a storm rolled down from the mountains, the worst of the season. Wind howled around the ranch house. Snow struck the windows in waves. By late afternoon, visibility had nearly vanished. Wyatt rode out to secure a section of fencing before dark. He told Nora he'd be back before supper. Then he disappeared into the white. Hours passed. The storm worsened. The house groaned beneath the wind. When Nora stepped outside to check the barn doors, a blast of snow nearly knocked her backward. She hurried toward the old storage shed behind the main barn. The smaller building offered shelter from the wind. Inside it was dim. Dust floated through lantern light. Old saddles hung from beams overhead. Broken harnesses rested on hooks. The storm rattled the walls. Nora moved deeper inside, then stopped. Something felt different. Behind a row of saddle racks, part of the rear wall sat slightly crooked. Not enough to notice at first glance. Enough to notice now. She lifted the lantern higher. A narrow seam cut through the wood. A hidden door. Her heartbeat quickened. Slowly, she stepped closer. The wind screamed outside. The lantern flame trembled. Nora reached for the edge of the panel and pulled. The hidden door swung inward. A small space waited beyond it. Dark. Silent. And at the center of the room sat a cedar chest. Large. Old. Carefully preserved. Nora took one step forward, then another. Lantern light spilled across the lid. Her breath caught, because carved into the wood were two words. Nora Whitaker. For a long moment, Nora simply stared. The lantern trembled slightly in her hand. Outside, the storm battered the walls of the old shed. Snow hissed across the roof. Wind pushed against the building like a living thing trying to get inside. But all of that seemed far away. Her name was carved into the cedar chest. Not painted. Not written. Carved. Slowly. Carefully. As if whoever had done it intended those letters to remain there for years. Nora knelt beside the chest. The cedar smelled faintly sweet despite its age. Her fingers rested on the brass latch. She should have left it alone. She knew that. This belonged to Wyatt. It was private. Yet nothing about this felt ordinary anymore. Her name was on it. At last she lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of envelopes tied together with faded blue ribbon. The paper had yellowed with age. Every envelope carried the same handwriting. Simple, neat, steady. Miss Nora Whitaker. The first letter sat on top. A date was written in the corner. September 1878. 9 years ago. Nora's breath caught. She carefully unfolded the paper. The words were plain. There was nothing poetic about them that somehow made them harder to read. I saw you today at the harvest fair. You were helping Mrs. Dawson carry supplies after everyone else had gone home. You laughed at something she said. I think it may be the nicest sound I've ever heard. I intended to introduce myself. I didn't. Maybe next time. Wyatt. Nora stared at the signature. The storm outside seemed to vanish completely. She opened the second letter, then the third, then another. Each one was written months apart, sometimes a year apart. None had ever been mailed. None had ever been delivered. And every one of them was about her. Not in a way that felt possessive. Not in a way that felt intrusive. More like observations from a distance. One letter mentioned seeing her leave church after her father's funeral. Another mentioned watching her repair a ranch hand's coat after he couldn't afford a replacement. One described a winter morning when she stood outside the bakery waiting for work before sunrise. He had noticed everything. Not just the important days, the ordinary ones, the lonely ones, the days nobody else remembered. Nora sat back against the wall. The lantern cast soft gold light across the pages. Her hands had stopped feeling cold. One letter was dated 3 years earlier. The year she lost her boarding room on Willow Street. The year she sold nearly everything she owned to stay afloat. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting seemed heavier somehow. She looked tired today. Tired in a way people shouldn't have to be. I almost crossed the street. I almost asked if she needed help. I didn't. Maybe that was cowardice. Maybe it was respect. I still don't know. The next letter contained only 3 lines. Nothing more. Nothing less. I keep hoping she'll never need me, and hoping one day she will. Nora read those words twice, then a third time. The room blurred. She lowered the page. For years, she had believed she was invisible. One woman trying to survive in a place where survival took most of a person's strength. She thought of the mornings she had opened her sewing shop alone. The evenings she had eaten supper by herself. The long winters. The empty rooms. The silent walks home. All that time, someone had been paying attention. Not asking for anything. Not stepping into her life. Just watching from a respectful distance and writing words he never intended her to see. A floorboard creaked somewhere behind her. Nora looked up sharply. Nothing. Only the storm. Only the old shed. She gathered the letters carefully, one by one, returning them exactly as she found them. The ribbon. The stack. The order. Everything. Then she closed the lid. When she finally stepped back into the snow, darkness had settled over Cedar Run Ranch. Lights glowed warmly in the windows of the house. Wyatt had returned. She could see his silhouette moving through the kitchen. A familiar figure. A man she suddenly realized she did not know nearly as well as she thought. The next 3 days passed quietly. Painfully quietly. Nora never mentioned the chest. Wyatt never mentioned the storm. Life continued. Breakfast at sunrise. Coffee beside the stove. Mending work near the east window. Yet everything felt different. When Wyatt placed a fresh log on the fire, she noticed. When he left the last biscuit for her without comment, she noticed. When he paused by the gate during a snowfall to make sure she had her scarf, she noticed. Every small kindness carried a different weight now. Every gesture seemed connected to those letters. One evening, she looked up from her sewing. Wyatt was repairing a saddle strap near the fireplace. The light caught his face. He looked exactly as he always had. Quiet, steady, careful. But now she could see the years hidden behind that calm expression. 9 years of silence. 9 years of choosing distance. 9 years of carrying something he had never expected to share. The realization left her strangely breathless. 3 days after discovering the chest, Nora entered the old shed again, only to make certain she hadn't imagined any of it. The hidden door remained open a crack. The chest sat exactly where she remembered. She closed the panel carefully and returned to the house. As she stepped through the kitchen door, she stopped. Wyatt stood beside the table. His gaze met hers, then drifted briefly toward the direction of the old shed. Only for a second, just long enough. Something changed in his expression. Not anger, not fear. Recognition. The smallest recognition. As though he already knew. As though he understood exactly what she had found. Neither of them said a word. But that night, for the first time since she arrived at Cedar Run Ranch, Nora was certain of something. Wyatt knew the chest had been opened, and somehow he had chosen to say nothing. That silence lasted 4 more days, 4 mornings of coffee steaming beside the stove, 4 evenings of firelight flickering across the walls of Cedar Run Ranch. Neither of them mentioned the letters, yet everything had changed. Nora noticed the way Wyatt always brushed snow from the porch before she stepped outside. She noticed how he left the better lantern filled and ready near the kitchen door. She noticed the pauses now, the moments when he seemed about to say something and then thought better of it. The chest had given meaning to things she once called coincidence. Late one afternoon, she finally carried the letters into the house. The ribbon was still tied around them. The paper felt fragile in her hands. Wyatt was seated at the kitchen table reviewing ranch accounts. Receipts from the feed supplier in Missoula lay beside a ledger book. He looked up when she entered. Then his eyes dropped to the letters. Everything became very quiet. Nora placed them gently on the table. I found them. For a moment, Wyatt didn't move. The fire cracked softly behind them. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods. Finally, he nodded. I know. No excuses. No explanations. Just honesty. Nora pulled out a chair. So it was always me? His gaze settled on the letters. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. The room seemed smaller somehow. Warmer. More vulnerable. You never planned to tell me? A faint smile touched one corner of his mouth. I never planned for you to need me. The words landed harder than anything she had read in the chest. Wyatt folded his hands together. I figured if life went well for you, you'd marry somebody else. Have a good life. Maybe leave Montana altogether. And if life didn't go well? His eyes met hers. Then I'd make sure there was somewhere safe for you if you ever came looking. Nora looked away first. Not because she wanted to, because she suddenly couldn't trust her voice. Before either could say more, a wagon rattled into the yard. An hour later, the quiet evening became something else entirely. Ezekiel Pike arrived with 2 men and a stack of documents. He claimed an old boundary debt connected to Cedar Run Ranch, a technical dispute buried years back in county records. Something complicated enough to sound convincing. Something dangerous enough to threaten part of Wyatt's grazing land. But over the winter, Nora had organized every ledger, receipt, and ranch document in the house. She knew exactly where everything was. While Ezekiel spoke, Nora disappeared into the office. She returned carrying account books, tax receipts, and a survey record signed years earlier by the county clerk. One by one, the facts dismantled Ezekiel's claim. The silence that followed was almost painful. Ezekiel left angry. For the first time, he left defeated. After the wagon disappeared down the road, twilight settled across the valley. The mountains glowed blue beneath fresh snow. Wyatt stood on the porch beside Nora. Neither spoke for several minutes. Then Wyatt reached into his coat pocket. There was supposed to be one more letter. Nora looked at him. Supposed to be. He nodded. The last one. He drew out a small velvet pouch. I never wrote it. Her heart beat a little faster. Why not? Because if the day ever came... He paused. I wanted to say it myself. From the pouch he removed a simple gold ring, worn smooth by years. My mother's. Nora stared at it, then at him. This man who had waited nearly a decade, who had asked for nothing, who had opened a door when she needed one most. The valley stretched silent around them. At last she stepped away from the railing and walked a few yards into the snow. She looked at the ranch, the barn, the house, the mountains beyond, the life she had almost never found. Then she turned around. Wyatt hadn't moved. He was still waiting, still giving her room to choose. Nora crossed the distance between them, took his hand, and held on. Not because winter had forced her here, not because she owed him gratitude, not because she needed saving, but because she chose him. The following spring, a new sign appeared beside the ranch road. Whitaker Saddle and Sewing. Customers came from across the valley. Wyatt built a larger workroom beside the east window where the morning light stayed longest. The cedar chest no longer hid behind a secret door. It sat openly on a shelf in the front room. Part of their story now, part of their home. And the final letter Wyatt never wrote was no longer necessary. Because from that day forward, nothing important between them was left unsaid. When I think about Nora and Wyatt, I don't remember the storm first. I don't remember the gossip in town, the long winter, or even the cedar chest hidden behind that old wall. I remember a door opening, a man stepping aside, and a woman who thought she was only asking for a way to survive. Maybe that's why this story stays with us. Because if we're honest, most of us have had a season when life felt cold enough to break something inside us. A season when we were carrying more than anyone could see. And maybe, just maybe, you've wondered what it would feel like if someone noticed. Not to rescue you, not to control your choices, just to quietly make room for you in their life. Wyatt's gift wasn't the ranch. It wasn't the letters. It was patience. And Nora's courage wasn't that she endured hard years alone. It was that when the truth finally stood in front of her, she allowed herself to reach back. Sometimes healing begins that way. Not with grand speeches, not with perfect timing, just with two people deciding they no longer need to hide their hearts from each other. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where it touched you most. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about second chances, quiet strength, unexpected love, and the kind of hope that arrives when it's least expected, I hope you'll stand a while. There are many more journeys waiting just down the trail, and I'd be honored to share the next one with you.